discharge the Committee on Foreign Relations from further consideration as Resolution 504. Madam President,
the clerk will report the motion.
I ask unanimous consent.
Motion to discharge S-Res 504, a resolution requesting information on Israel's human rights practices pursuant to Section 502(b)(c) of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 from the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the vote. Senator Sanders for up to 25 minutes, Senator Merkley for up to 5 minutes, Senator Cardin for up to 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Okay. Thank you, Madam President. Let me apologize to my colleagues for beginning late. Turns out that today was not a great day to travel by plane, and I thank the leadership for delaying the vote as well. Madam President, we will soon be voting on a resolution requesting information on Israel's human rights practices under Section 502(b)(c) of the Foreign Assistance Act. There has been some confusion as to what this resolution does and does not do. So I'd like to say a few words about why it is critical that this resolution come to the floor, why it's imperative that this resolution be passed, imperative that we have this debate and recorded vote, and why Congress must have the information requested in this resolution. Madam President, very sensibly, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, as amended, requires that any security assistance or military equipment provided by the United States of America to any country must be used in line with internationally recognized human rights. This is not a radical idea and something I hope that we all agree with. This act prohibits assistance to any government that engages in a consistent pattern of human rights violation. This is U.S. law established over 50 years ago, not a new idea. The Act also provides Congress with several oversight tools to ensure that this law is followed. One such tool is Section 502(b)(c), which allows Congress to direct the State Department to provide information on the human rights record of any country receiving U.S. military assistance. Madam President, that is what this resolution does, in line with 50-year-old existing law. It directs the State Department to provide any credible information it may have on potential violations of internationally recognized human rights by Israel in its military campaign in Gaza. It focuses on the denial of the right to life caused by indiscriminate or disproportionate military operations, as well as by restrictions on humanitarian access. It also asks for information on steps the U.S. has taken to limit civilian risk in this war, a certification that the Leahy laws are being fully applied, and a summary of the arms and munitions provided to Israel since October 7th. This is a simple request for information. That is all this resolution is about. It does not alter aid to Israel in any way. It simply requests a report on how U.S. aid is being used. This is a very modest, common-sense proposal, and frankly, hard for me to understand why anyone would oppose it. So, Mr. President, we will soon be voting on a very simple question. Do we support asking the State Department for information on whether human rights violations may have occurred using U.S. assistance in Israel's military campaign? That's it. That's what this resolution is about. It is non-controversial, and it should be passed in large numbers. All right. This is not the case today. We don't have the information. The State Department will provide a report. The information requested in this resolution is straightforward to provide, not hard for the State Department, and is critical to congressional oversight. The State Department should have it readily available as required under current U.S. law and policy. Further, in the highly unlikely event the 30-day deadline is not met by the State Department, the law allows Congress to pass a measure continuing aid. After the report is received, Congress may then consider any changes it deems necessary to security assistance to the country in question. Any such resolution must pass both houses of Congress and be signed by the President. But again, what we are voting on today is simply a request for information. And, Mr. President, let me say a few words as to why this resolution is necessary, and these rather horrific photographs behind me, I think, say it all. First, it is necessary because of the scale of destruction in Gaza, the indiscriminate nature of the military campaign, the humanitarian catastrophe that is now occurring, and the limits on humanitarian access: food, water, medical supplies, and fuel. Second, because of the extensive use of U.S. weapons in attacks that have killed thousands of civilians. Much of the destruction that has taken place in Gaza has been done with U.S. weapons. And thirdly, I am concerned about the implications of some of the very extreme statements and unclear intentions coming out of the Netanyahu government. Mr. President, it has been more than 100 days since this war began, with the horrific Hamas terrorist attack which killed 1,200 innocent men, women, and children in Israel, and which took more than 200 hostages, over 100 of whom are still cruelly being held in captivity as of today. And while there is no question in my mind that Israel has the right to defend itself and go to war against Hamas, who started this terrible situation, Israel does not have the right to go to war against the entire Palestinian people and innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. And tragically, that is what we are seeing right now. As we all know, the military campaign being waged by the right-wing Netanyahu government has led to massive destruction and widespread civilian harm. This has been far and away the most intensive bombing campaign of the 21st century. And as President Biden has said repeatedly, and the press and human rights monitors have exhaustively documented, this bombardment has been largely indiscriminate. Mr. President, the results of this bombing campaign has been catastrophic, and I underline the word catastrophic. Since October 7th, the start of the war, over 24,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli bombs, and over 60,000 have been injured and wounded. And, Mr. President, 70% of these victims are women and children. And it is believed that thousands more victims lie under the rubble of destroyed buildings in Gaza. Since the beginning of this war, 1.9 million Palestinian men, women, and children have been driven from their homes. That is 85%. 85% of the total population of Gaza has been forced out of their homes. Where are they going? They've been driven here, they've been driven there. They do not even know today whether they are ever going to be able to return to their homes. These are impoverished people who have no idea as to what their future is or will be. Despite the sharing of coordinates with Israeli forces, 40 United Nations facilities have sustained direct hits, 61 UN installations have suffered collateral damage, and 150 UN workers have been killed. 150 UN workers have been killed. Mr. President, the United Nations reports that over 234,000 housing units have been damaged and more than 46,000 homes completely destroyed in Gaza, amounting to nearly 70% of the housing stock, a figure confirmed by academic analysis of satellite radar data. That means, and this is rather an incredible reality, that means that the destruction of Gaza after 100 days has surpassed the destruction of Dresden during World War II, where half the homes in that city were destroyed, and is beyond the damage in dozens of other German cities subjected to years of bombing during World War II. Today, Mr. President, not only are the vast majority of people in Gaza homeless, but they lack food, water, medical supplies, and fuel. A recent UN report indicates that half of the population of about 2.2 million people are at risk of starvation, and 90% say they regularly go without food for a whole day. And parents there go out of their way to make sure that their kids eat first. The chief economist at the World Food Program said that the humanitarian disaster in Gaza was among the worst he had ever seen. Aid groups say that in the coming weeks, the entire population of Gaza could face famine. Mr. President, let us be clear. The reason as to why this resolution must be passed today is that right now as we speak, hundreds of thousands of children in Gaza, innocent children, are starving right before our eyes. We cannot turn away. We must act. Tragically, despite the efforts of the UN and others, despite the growing humanitarian crisis we are seeing, the situation has actually gotten worse in terms of getting aid to the people in need, to these children. Aid groups say that humanitarian access actually deteriorated in January compared to December. Trucks are crossing the border much too slowly, much too few. But even these trucks can't go beyond the immediate border area because the Netanyahu government won't let them proceed in a way that is safe. That is the situation as it stands today. Humanitarian workers who have spent decades serving in war zones say that this catastrophe goes beyond anything they have ever seen. And Mr. President, let me repeat. This is not some tragedy taking place in Asia and Africa. God knows there are enough tragedies all over the world. But this is a tragedy in which we, the United States of America, are complicit. Much of what is happening, much of the bombardment and the other actions that we are seeing now is happening right now with U.S. arms and equipment. In other words, whether we like it or not, the United States is complicit in the nightmare that millions of Palestinians are now experiencing. Mr. President, the Wall Street Journal reported on December 1st that the U.S. had provided at least 15,000 bombs and 57,000 artillery shells to Israel, including more than 5,400 huge 2,000-pound bombs that can flatten entire neighborhoods. The Washington Post reported that in just 6 weeks after October 7th, Israel dropped more than 22,000 American-supplied bombs on Gaza. 22,000 American-supplied bombs. CNN reported that nearly half of these bombs were unguided, so-called dumb bombs. So, Mr. President, that is where we find ourselves at this moment. 24,000 Palestinians in Gaza are dead. 70% are women and children, and 60,000 have been wounded. 70% of the housing stock has been damaged or destroyed, and almost 2 million people are trying to survive with inadequate supplies of food, water, medicine, or fuel. And the humanitarian situation is getting worse by the minute. Hundreds of thousands of beautiful children are facing starvation. Mr. President, given the scale of the destruction and the extensive use of American arms, military equipment in this campaign, Congress must act. And that is why we must pass this 502B resolution. We must ensure that U.S. aid is being used in accordance with international human rights and our own laws. Mr. President, a vote for this resolution is simply to request more information on a tragic situation that the American people care about. Go back home, I say to my colleagues. Red state, blue state, purple state, this issue, this suffering is on the minds of the American people. And that's all that this resolution does. Now, a vote against this resolution, which I have a hard time really understanding, it says, quote, I don't want more information. I'm going to vote against this resolution. I don't want a report from the State Department. I don't want to know how U.S. military aid in Israel is being used. I don't want to know what responsibility the United States may have for this humanitarian disaster. I want to keep my head in the sand. I don't want to see what's going on. And frankly, Mr. President, no matter what your view on this terrible war may be, agree with me, you don't agree with me, we cannot bury our eyes in the sand. The truth is that since that terrible day on October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel, the Senate has had little meaningful debate on this war, despite the horrific toll and the deep concerns of many Americans. We have passed symbolic resolutions, but we have not considered a single measure that grapples with the unprecedented destruction, the humanitarian crisis, or the use of American weapons in a military campaign that has left so many dead, wounded, and displaced. Now, no matter what happens on this vote, I know that this will not be the end of this debate. It is just the beginning. And finally, Mr. President, I would like to say a word about this resolution's broader importance. Right now, we are focusing on Israel, as we should, given the situation in Gaza. But in general, what this provision does is extremely sensible. It demands accountability as to how U.S. military aid is used and whether the recipients of that aid abide by international law and our own human rights standards. This is true for Israel, for Saudi Arabia, and for any country that receives U.S. military aid. Frankly, I hope this vote is the first of many as we take a hard look at how our military aid is being used. Therefore, Mr. President, pursuant to 22 U.S.C. 2304, and in accordance with the provisions of Section 601B of the International Security Assistance and Arms Export Control Act of 1976, I move to discharge the Committee on Foreign Relations of the further consideration of S-Res 504, a resolution requesting information on Israel's human rights practices pursuant to Section 502BC of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961.
The Senator's request is already pending.
Thank you. Mr. President, I reserve the balance of my time, and I would yield the floor to Senator Merkley.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, on October 7th, Israel suffered a horrific terrorist attack by Hamas. It echoes very much the impact that we felt here in America on 9/11 when we suffered a horrific terrorist attack. And it connected our hearts to the hearts of Israelis in a powerful way. And certainly, I completely supported and support now the cause of Israel to go after Hamas to stop this terrorist threat. I fully support the grief they feel with the hostages who remain and their desire, their goal to get those hostages free. And I know that the U.S. has been incredibly working in partnership with Israel toward that objective. Tonight, we are further into that campaign, and we have before us a request for a report from the administration through the exercise of 502BC on any potential violations of internationally recognized human rights that may have occurred in this conflict. A request for a report that would be due in 30 days. And I'm here tonight still supporting strongly Israel's right to go after Hamas, but also saying that we have a responsibility to ask hard questions about how a war is conducted. Every war. And we weigh in on human rights all around the world. And I chair a commission, co-chair a commission that looks into China's abuses of human rights in all kinds of dimensions, from Tibet to the slavery of the Uyghur population. So why is this request for this information important? There are three reasons. And they all relate to the validity of targeting Hamas, but the invalidity, potential invalidity of a strategy that also targets the Palestinian people living in Gaza. And understanding this dimension, understanding it in terms of humanitarian aid, understanding it in terms of the huge toll on civilians that the bombing has taken, understanding it in terms of the dimension of displacement, where so many have been displaced, driven towards the south, crowded into Rafah along the border with Egypt. So I'm going to briefly address each of those. I was one of the first members of this chamber to call for immediate ceasefire and a massive influx of humanitarian aid because of the enormous calamity that is occurring in Gaza with the strategy that Israel is using of mass bombing and artillery shells. One aspect of this is how does one get humanitarian aid in to assist those innocent civilians who have been so profoundly impacted. So earlier this month, Senator Van Hollen and I went to the Rafah crossing on the border between Egypt and Gaza. We talked to the governments, we talked to the international aid workers that work through the United Nations, alphabet soup of organizations. We talked to the seasoned individuals who have worked in war conflict zones around this globe. And they all said that getting humanitarian aid in is extraordinarily difficult for two reasons. And the first of those reasons was it's very hard to get pre-clearance for the aid. Trucks filled with food, water, medical supplies were lined up for miles in the desert waiting to be granted entry into Gaza. A truck driver can wait more than a week, even when items are pre-approved, to get through the inspection. The inspection serves a purpose of stopping dual-use items. That is legitimate. But if it takes a week when aid is desperately needed, that means people are greatly shorted food, clean water, and medical supplies. And even when inspected pre-cleared, they could be rejected. And when an item is rejected, the entire truck is rejected. And we saw a warehouse filled with rejected items, including things like solar-powered refrigerators for medical uses and water decontamination supplies. And then if trucks are cleared to get in, then it's very hard for them to get in unless there's deconfliction. If there isn't deconfliction, then the drivers risk driving and dying when a bomb or artillery shells drops in their path. And in fact, so many aid workers have been killed and truck drivers have been killed. And we know that before the war, 500 trucks a day were able to get into Gaza. And now, just last week, it was less than an average of 150 trucks when people are absolutely desperate. So, there is the possibility and the hope of the U.S. working intensely with Israel to dramatically change this situation and get those trucks into Gaza. But there is also the value of having a report from our government, understanding to which degree they have already worked with Israel. And I ask to complete the balance of my remarks.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you. So, second.
Mr. President, could we just have an estimate of how much longer you're going to be?
An estimate of 5 minutes.
I would not object to 5 minutes.
Thank you. So our government should work to solve this problem, but we've been working to solve it. So having a report announced by our government to what degree these strategies of a dysfunctional inspection process and a dysfunctional deconfliction process are a part of a deliberate strategy to create and intensify the shortage of food and water and medical assistance. The second concern I have is about the bombing and artillery shells, which our president has described as an indiscriminate campaign of bombing. We all understand that this terrible attack from Hamas, that Hamas is the enemy, but the Palestinians who live in Gaza and are not part of Hamas, they did not attack Israel. They are not the enemy. And thus it's essential that Netanyahu's government's war strategy against Hamas actually targets Hamas and not innocent Palestinians. It's estimated that 2/3 of the people killed, 2/3 killed, have been women and children. That's some 8,000 children, 8,000 women. It's a massive toll. So a report under 502(b)(c) would be valuable in understanding this strategy. And we are closely tied to it, which is another reason we should want this information. We've supplied over 10,000 tons of military equipment since October 7th. We've included 15,000 bombs and 57,000 artillery shells. It would be useful to have our own government analyze this and understand why we are resupplying the very weapons that our government has said Israel should quit using and do a more targeted campaign. That's the goal of 502(b)(c), to get a report, to get answers. My third concern is the displacement. The widespread bombing has produced some 85% of the people displaced in Gaza. A leaked intelligence ministry paper, Israeli intelligence ministry paper, said that there are three options, and option C is a preferred option involving an air campaign in the north, driving people to the south, hopefully displacing them into the Sinai. That has a spooky similarity to the facts on the ground. And of course, such a displacement strategy has been called out by some ministers of the Israeli government, one of them calling for exactly that strategy, saying we want a Gazan Nakba, that people will not be able to return. So we have the government paper, we have the testimony by ministry officials that that was their goal. Is that their goal? The government of Israel has now adamantly said that is not their goal. That is useful to have our government's best understanding, because we should never be complicit in a displacement campaign if that is in fact what is going on. So colleagues, we look at conditions around the world, and normally it's folks we have little relationship with, although sometimes we have a relationship with, but it's an on and off again, like the situation we have with Saudi Arabia. In this situation, it is our friend and partner that we've worked so closely with, and it may feel awkward and difficult to say we need to take a close look. But when there's been this level of casualties, and we are this closely tied to it, it is the right thing to do to get the type of information that would come through this request. I encourage my colleagues to support it.
The Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I have a great deal of respect for my two colleagues. I think every one of us are concerned about what we see in regards to the crisis in Gaza, what we see in regards to the need for humanitarian assistance, for innocent Gazians being caught in this battle. But the resolution that's being presented here today is the wrong vehicle to deal with this issue. So let me start by saying that the resolution does a lot more than requesting information. For you see, the information from those partners that get security assistance from the United States, the State Department today must provide the information of their compliance with our laws. That report is already required for all recipients of security aid. What this resolution requires, a report within 30 days on specific issues concerning conduct in Gaza. And it's very specific as to what the State Department must provide. I'll just give you one example, and there are many, many other examples here. They have to certify that no unit of the Israel security forces that received U.S. assistance since January 1st, 2018 has committed any gross violation of human rights. Now, they got to do that within 30 days, or aid is suspended. And once they give a report, it triggers privilege resolutions on this floor to cut off aid to Israel. And I strongly disagree with my colleagues. 502B was never intended to be used against an ally during a war. It's never been used for that purpose. That's not the right vehicle to deal with this. Mr. President, this is the 102nd day since Hamas's brutal attack against Israel. 102 days that hostages have been held. Our thoughts and prayers with the hostages, and we all agree that Israel has the right to defend itself. The challenges are made much more difficult because they're going against an enemy that has sworn to destroy the nation, Israel. And they still believe that. And they're still conducting themselves with the threat to Israel's sovereignty and safety. Missiles are still available to be shot into Israel. They're still there in Gaza. We know what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea. We know what Iran is doing in Iraq. We know the problems on Israel's northern border by Hezbollah. Over 80,000 Israelis have had to evacuate their homes in northern Israel, 100,000 in the southern part. There's a war going on, and it's made much more difficult because Hamas, sworn to destroy Israel, embeds its operations within the civilian population, has a tunneling network to try to protect its military assets, making it very difficult for Israel to be able to eliminate the threat. At the same time, we know how much military might was in Gaza on October the 7th. We're supposed to have had border security to make sure that didn't get into Gaza. There's supposed to be inspections. Didn't work. I don't understand why the Israelis are concerned by the way in which the supplies get into Gaza, because there is a concern of dual use and supplying the terrorists in their efforts to destroy Israel. These are all very challenging issues that we have to deal with. Now, this resolution, as I said before, is much more than just requesting information. Its passage would be a gift to Hamas, a gift to Iran. It would show a division between Israel and the United States. It's an indictment against Israel. Make no mistake about it. It makes it more challenging with sensitive negotiations taking place as we are here on additional hostages being released. It makes it more difficult for us to deal with preventing the escalation of the conflict. If Iran believes that the United States is not with Israel, believe me, it makes it more likely we're going to see additional attacks in that region. The Biden administration is seeking to contain this conflict and not to see it spread and grow out of control. It is pressing for a shift to a more targeted campaign against Hamas military infrastructure and the perpetrators of the October 7th attacks. It's pressing to get more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And yes, we can and should continue to push Israel towards a targeted prosecution of the war against Hamas in Gaza. But passing this resolution does not do that. In fact, I would say it is counterproductive to it. And make no mistake, our passing the resolution triggers this. This is not a resolution that goes to this House and signed by the President. If we pass this, the process is triggered to cut off aid to Israel during war. And for those reasons, Mr. President, I move to table the motion to discharge of S-Res 504, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Mr. President.
Is there a sufficient second?
Mr. President.
There appears to be.
Mr. President.
The yeas and nays are ordered.
Ask consent for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Mr. President, 24,000 Palestinians are dead, 70% of whom are women and children. 70% of the housing stock has been damaged or destroyed, and almost 2 million people are trying to survive with inadequate supplies of food, water, medical supplies, or fuel. And as we speak, hundreds of thousands of children face starvation. The time is now for the U.S. Senate to act. Thank you. I ask for a no vote on the table again.
The question is on the motion to table. The yeas and nays have previously been ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Clark.